Welcome back, everyone, to the Workplace Justice Podcast. I am your host, Mahir Nisar, and I am excited to introduce to you our guest on this episode, Dr. Jade Singleton. Jade has spent more than a decade leading impactful communications, people, and leadership strategies at the nation's top nonprofit and investment banking firms. She is the co-founder of Johnson Squared LLC, a consulting company that creates and leads forward-leading corporate DEIB conversations, employee experiences, policies, and paths to equity. It infuses psychological safety, equitable work strategies, and an agile approach throughout its forward-leaning model. Jade created Johnson Squared together with her sister Noelle for companies and professionals that are serious about real change. Jade's research work, leadership challenges, African American communication in the corporate environment has been leveraged and cited by academic scholars over 75 times and DEIB professionals at all stages of DEIB learning and practice. Dr. Jade Singleton, welcome to the show. So I've seen your posts about attributional ambiguity. For our listeners, what is attributional ambiguity?
Yeah, so attributional ambiguity is when you're not quite sure what component of your identity, so who you are, is responsible for a particular outcome. So, for instance, did I not get the promotion because I'm a Black person, or is it because I'm a woman, or is it both, or some sort of combination, right? And so the way that folks that are from marginalized identities look at the world is different because you have to protect yourself in a sense. So you're constantly scanning the environment to ensure that you're getting treated fairly, that you're not being taken advantage of. And the reality exists, right? That the data proves, right? That women, and especially women of color, are paid less, etc. So there's a reality that you're always kind of bumping up against.
Right.
And you're trying to figure out what component, what combination of who I am is leading to this particular outcome. And it's very stressful. Attributional ambiguity is very stressful because you're always on. You're always having to be hypervigilant.
And so I guess, and I often see this, and I see somewhat of the opposite scenario that also occurs a lot of times is when people experience any form of unfairness within their work environment, that they're actually reluctant to even look at who they are as an identity to kind of figure out whether or not perhaps their race had something to do with it, perhaps them being as a part of an intersectional experience, that it's based upon that identity that played a role in how they were being treated differently, that there's this internal audit of completely denying it themselves. Have you seen that often, like in terms of individuals actually gaslighting themselves out of recognizing what's actually occurring?
Absolutely. Absolutely. And we see this a lot when we talk about something called survivorship bias.
Mm-hmm.
So, I've made it this far, and it's been solely based upon, my own effort. It had nothing to do with any combination of identities, etc. And so people that might even be in my same demographic have to do the same, go through the same hard knocks. And what that really is an attempt to make sense of your own career trauma a lot of times. So when I'm working with folks and they're telling me, I've never had these types of infractions before. I've never dealt with racism or sexism before. I always want to ask, are you sure about that? Right?
Yeah.
Let's think back to some other experiences. Let's look at your phenomenal resume and how you're 3 times more qualified than folks that are currently at your level, right? And so I think some of that is protection. We're wired to believe and want to believe that things are fair, that things are equitable. So behavioral scientists have done massive studies on this with primates, right? That
Right.
understand the concept of fairness and equity, the basics. And so we want that. We want to know that we're on a level playing field. So some of that is denial. Some of it is managing career trauma. I have to be able to keep barreling on. And also, I'll say this, and I hate to kind of run on, but some people are just tired of it. You're tired of every day thinking about your race.
Yeah.
You're tired of showing up in the world that way. You don't want to have that posture. You're tired of the hypervigilance, right? And so you feel like maybe I'll just opt out of this altogether. Hey, I'm here on my merits, and whatever happens, happens. So there's elements of that too. It's exhaustion.
Yeah. That certainly makes sense. So, in your practice, you don't only work with companies, but also with DEI professionals in your academy, the Sarah Jane Academy. What are the
Yes.
biggest challenges DEI professionals are currently facing, in your opinion?
I would say that the biggest challenge is that there's no centralized type of school of thought around DEI. So DI practitioners kind of feel like they're out there on their own. A
Mm,
lot of the certification programs that are run, and I say ironically, by Ivy League, right,
right.
focus on theory.
Yeah.
And so the real on the ground, as it's happening, practices are left out. And so what
Mm,
you find is a lot of DEI practitioners looking for any information that they can ultimately find to be able to practice safely. And that's because DEI really is, while it's presented as if it's this kind of new thing, right?
yeah.
It's really not. It's really a fusion of a couple of different disciplines. It's change management, which was a huge one. It's sociology, essentially, and it's also organizational psychology.
Mhm.
And so you've got folks that are kind of circling around trying to figure out the right type of combination. And it's interesting that we just talked about attributional ambiguity because there's a lot of ambiguity as well in the
Yeah.
DEI space right now.
And I mean, in terms of that specific challenge, I mean, I follow a lot of different DI professionals, and I follow a lot of their content that they put out with respect to a lot of the experiences that people of color have within the work environment, and how there's an effort to try to change the culture that that employer has, and trying to look deeper within. And a lot of times, it's so much of a crossroad between DEI and efforts by the company, which is an effort trying to brand themselves and market themselves to be
Yeah.
equitable, inclusive, and diverse. But with the reality that DEI practitioners are also up against this thing where they're in somewhat of a part of the department within the company that maybe doesn't drive revenue in accordance with the general thought process of way the company structures are. Obviously, in the long run, we see that there's obviously going to be profitability. Short-term thought processes indicate, oh, we're not seeing any profit or revenues directly from these efforts. Do you find that to be a challenge for DEI professionals in terms of getting really somewhat having ownership of that
Yeah.
process?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So yeah, the value prop is definitely
Hmm.
something that can prove to be difficult because there is the tendency to want to tie resources to numbers. So if I'm
Yeah.
hiring a full DI staff, how do I measure? That's another big thing. Like, how do I measure that progress is ultimately being made and that I'm making, the right resource allocation to this? And so I think that is definitely a struggle. But what I find is helpful is when you're focusing on culture. People understand that you cannot do any type of transformation. Everything has to start with people.
Right.
And so talking about, looking at your attrition rates, looking at, who's staying, who's going, which component, what segmentation of of the populations within your organization are dissatisfied and may ultimately share that information. And
Right.
so there's a lot of different things too. There's a risk mitigation element to DEI that I think a lot of companies found out the very hard way post George Floyd. And
Mhm.
so I think when we're giving the value proposition, there's a tendency by some practitioners to want to shy away from some of that. You want to focus on, increased innovation and all those wonderful things. I like to focus on the reality. If
Mhm.
something else happens like it has post George Floyd,
Sure.
and the world is on fire socially, what is your response? Do you have a strategic response to kind of protect your corporate reputation? And I
Mhm.
think that's missed a lot of times in some of these value propositions. It's how you literally are showing up in the world.
Yeah. And it's interesting that you say that because there was obviously a lot of there's a lot of different companies that will, in many ways, remove brand endorsements from certain individuals that perhaps do not fit um, with their values that they have at least marketed and branded. There's two things. One is the public domain, right? You have services and products that people are selling, these
Yeah.
businesses are selling. And then you also have the internal workings of the people that are actually a part of that deliverable. And there's a lot of inconsistency I often hear, and I'm sure maybe you've come across this many times as well, is that what is being reflected on the outside, branding wise, reputational wise, is not consistent with the reality of what's within.
Right. And
And
those that
yeah,
never last.
yeah,
Stan Slap, who's probably the foremost cultural expert when it comes to corporations in the U.S., um, often says, if you can't sell it inside, you can't sell it outside.
yeah, beautiful.
So if you cannot get the adoption internally, you might have a flash in the pan, fantastic launch. It's not something that you're going to be able to hold on to if your employees don't believe it.
Yeah, yeah. So I wanted to talk a little bit about the Sarah Jane Academy. Tell us a little bit
Yeah.
about the inspiration behind the Sarah Jane Academy, and I'd love to learn more about Sarah Jane as well, your
Yeah,
aunt.
absolutely. Sure. So, the Sarah Jane Academy was something I founded because I saw that there was an issue. I mean, you had a
Yeah.
lot of theory. I was meeting with DEI practitioners constantly with questions, trying to figure out the right way to centralize some of the information. I said, why don't I just go ahead, get the SHRM certification, and launch it myself?
Hmm.
And what I was seeing was that not only was there a gap in the content, but what I developed Sarah Jane to do would be to help with some of the equity of access.
Hmm.
And these certifications that are now being more and more required for DEI positions, we're charging thousands and thousands of dollars, right? So if you're going to one of the Ivies to get this, you're looking at a couple grand at least.
Hmm.
And so there were a lot of people that were being priced out. And I didn't want that to happen. So what I wanted to do was offer it initially as pay what you can, and then
Wow.
get it down to about a tenth of what the average cost is for our next cycles, so that we wouldn't have those barriers. And so the reason that it's named Sarah Jane Academy, as you mentioned, is after my aunt. She was the first Black female professor in the United States. But
Wow.
she also was a feminist before that was a thing. She was an abolitionist. Two of her brothers, so my uncles, were killed for their operations on the Underground Railroad. So she was from an Underground Railroad family, right,
Right.
that literally
Right.
would gave their lives to freedom. And so, but her biggest thing was education, and that Black people be able to have education and access of education. And so when her brother founded Wilberforce University, which was was the first Black owned and operated HBCUs in the country, still there in Ohio,
Hmm.
she, was able to step into a role of teaching and really grooming folks who had been left out for so very long. And that really spoke to me. Create a place. And that's what she did. And in a very small way, because this is in no way comparative, I wanted to do the same thing. I wanted to create a space for folks that were like-minded, and make it equitable, make it accessible, and make it the best. I wanted to offer the very best quality, very best information that I could.
That's awesome. And you bring up a word that I think I want to ask a lot of people this question because I feel like it's something that we often kind of overlook. What does it mean to you to create an equitable environment? What does equity mean for you?
Yeah. So equity to me means that every person has the tools that they need specifically. So the tools for them to be able to become the best version of themselves that they can. It means that there's not huge mountain boulders and barriers for one person,
Hmm.
and just a crack in the road for another that they have to step over, right? It's kind
Hmm.
of leveling the playing field. And I think a great way to think about equity is really equity of access. I'm always asking, like, how do folks show up and get to the table, decision making tables, for instance, within organizations? What is their path to get there? If one person's path looks like it's insurmountable and it's going to take,
Yeah.
10 times longer, and another person has a streamlined path to get there, that tells me there may be some inequity there.
Yeah, for sure. And I mean, it's certainly something that we often see, and it's so hard in many ways to hear. And I've seen this happen so many times. It's such a repetitive response to the idea that, what you're explaining is that there is some unfairness in terms
Yeah.
of access to opportunity. Whereas there are people out there that perhaps may not have, they're privileged to the degree that they may never have to ever experience that level of inequity in their life. So good for them. But that being said, oftentimes they say, work harder.
Sure.
What would you
Yes.
say to somebody that says that? Work harder.
Yeah. Yeah. I would say that one, and I have heard that before, like you can overcome it. My question is always, why should you have to do that?
Yes. Yes.
Do you know what I mean? Like,
Yep.
why should I, because I was born Black, born a woman, born, middle class, why should it be this much harder for my child to be able to make it versus someone else's? If I'm able to produce the same amount of resources, they've done studies that have shown
Yep.
that Black boys, for instance, coming from poverty and Black boys coming from the middle class, there's zero distinction as far as their earnings. That is the only group that we can see that with. So when people say work harder, number one, they don't understand the data, because a lot of these folks did work harder, sometimes triple, quadruple times
Yeah.
harder. Just
Yeah.
get basics.
Basic, right?
Exactly. So I say you need to be looking at the actual data, and you need to understand and figure out why you feel as if folks should have to deal with more obstacles than others instead of
Exactly.
eradicating.
Yeah. Yeah. Absolutely.
Yeah.
What career advice would you give to women of color, in line with the issues that are astonishingly omnipresent in today's workplaces, involving discrimination, racism, pay gap? What kind of advice would you give to them?
Yeah. Well, I'll say two words: walk away. I think that there can be a feeling of being trapped for a lot of women of color, where you feel as if you can't speak up, you don't feel safe to challenge. I say that there's always different opportunities that are available. I understand obstacles. I understand, having to dig in and get through what you need to ultimately get through. But I think the most empowering thing that I can tell women, especially women of color, is that you do have the ability to walk away from a situation that's damaging you, and you do have, the option to walk away from a situation that's just unfair, fundamentally unfair. Because what we see is that it impacts you so deeply. It causes so many complications in your life, professionally and personally, that the cost is not worth it. And I think the other thing I would say is that I don't care what anyone tells you, nowhere it is always the same. People always want to say, oh, well, you're going to get this anywhere. No, you're
Right.
not.
Right.
I've worked in companies that were wonderful companies where I felt extremely psychologically safe, super inclusive, paid me fair, paid me on time. I could raise my hand and ask for what I want, and I got it. There are teams and organizations that do exist like that for you. So you're not trapped in a perpetual state of having to deal with unfairness and injustice. There is somewhere for you to go.
That's wonderful. That's deeply appreciated. For those that are listening, I think that should play into a lot of circumstances where people feel stuck and don't feel that there's anything out there that could truly give them a fair shot. And
Right.
people usually do get stuck in those unjust situations. I tend to always advocate. I completely agree with you. I mean, the idea of walking away from toxic, abusive work environments makes sense, right? preserving your mental and emotional well-being needs to be a priority. We have so much mental health illness right now that
Yes.
it is alarming, and it's completely just like overlooked. And it's really sad that we've allowed people to get to this stage, and a lot of it has to do with a lot of the environments that ultimately are being nurtured. And
True.
I come from the thought process, obviously, as an attorney and focusing on workplace justice, where I advocate for accountability.
Yeah.
And the advocacy for accountability, obviously, with the intent of kind of educating people on how they need to identify when something is illegal versus
Yes.
when it's not, and when it is illegal, to make sure that you have the necessary tools to seek accountability, and when
Yeah.
it's legal but unjust and unfair, to, like what you said, walk away from it because it's not worth it. Yeah.
Yeah.
And so I wanted to ask you this question about what we have been hearing. I think it's been recognized this year as probably one of the most, um, I don't know what kind of an award it got, but it was basically termed as the most used word of this year,
Oh,
which is,
2024.
was it? I think it was gaslighting. So,
Yeah.
what are the common themes that you see with respect to corporate gaslighting?
Yeah. So corporate gaslighting, I love talking about corporate gaslighting. So I'm actually writing a book on corporate gaslighting.
Oh,
That's how
wow.
much I love it.
Amazing.
So, corporate gaslighting, what I can say some of the themes are is that it lives, just like we were talking about attribution and ambiguity, it lives in this gray space. It thrives in this very gray area where you're not quite sure if you're being socially isolated. The uncertainty that you feel at work is kind of the first sign that you need to be looking around and seeing if things are being presented to you as they truly are. So the
Mm,
fundamental thing about gaslighting is that it gets you to second guess your reality.
right.
So, the boss that says, don't worry about coming to the leadership meeting and you don't come, and then later you're lambasted about it. Well,
Yeah.
you weren't at the meeting. Well, you said, don't come to the meeting. No, I don't remember that. Things like that. Small social isolation. So, kind of counting you out of information that might help you get further faster. So looking at all of those different symptoms and trying to figure out, hey, being sure within yourself first. So kind of checking yourself, but also understanding that gaslighting lives in the gray.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's harmful. I mean, it's so harmful to people that experience it. And I often see it when a lot of my clients go through the process of reaching out to their employer, their HR, and really bringing to their attention some form of injustice that's occurring, whether it's on the basis of their race or their gender or a combination of both, that they're not being given a fair opportunity. They're being set up to fail, that they're being structured to be exited out. The performance improvement plan is showing up. Things are just starting to make it seem like, okay, I'm not included. There's a whole narrative that's being constructed against me. I raised this complaint, and now it seems like my performance is an issue. So
Sure.
there's always this ongoing dilemma, and a lot of people, when they experience gaslighting, a lot of people may not be able to recognize that they're being gaslighted, and then they'll move towards looking at themselves and saying, did I say something? Did I do something?
Yes.
Is it
Yes.
me? Is it really?
Yeah.
Maybe it's me. Maybe it's not. Maybe they're right. Maybe what they're saying is my performance is not so good. Maybe I
Right.
should just, like, maybe I have to change. And all of a sudden, your your authentic self is being impacted, chipping away at who you are because they
Yes.
don't want you there. And
Yeah.
I feel like there's a significant harm that comes from it. So
Sure.
So, Dr. Singleton, thank you so much for today. I really deeply appreciate the conversation. Appreciate all your work. I actually would actually love to learn more about the Sarah Jane Academy. I'd love to enroll in it. I'd love to see what
Sure.
you're offering, so that way I can, really help and make a difference to. This is what we're all trying to do, right? We're all trying to make a difference to our world, to make our society better for everyone. And so, yeah, I wanted to thank you for taking out the time to do this. And I appreciate you.
Yes, thank you. I wish it was longer, the time with you today. So thank you so much. This has been fantastic.
Awesome. Thank you.
Okay. Have a good one.
You too. You take care now.